So you were how old in 1953?
7.
7 years old?
Yes.
Okay, so you would have, now it was early enough that it was a Tuesday,
Yes.
and were you in school that day?
Of course. Yep.
Okay.
And we had got out of school at 3:30. I would have been home by about 3:45 or 4 o'clock at the latest.
Mm-hmm. Before the tornado, what was the day like?
The day was a hot day. I think it was humid. I can recall when the patrol line broke up, as the term was, I was conscious of wind blowing through the telephone lines. I have no idea if it connected, but I remarked at that moment how unusual, because the sky was clear, but that there was enough of a breeze so you could hear the whistling of the wind through the telephone lines. And got home, and my father said, we're going down to, both my mother and father are from the next neighborhood over, Britain Square. And so Dad wanted to go down to his parents' house for something. And he said, you want to come along? I was an only child for another year before my sister was born in April 1954. Mm-hmm. So it was, as far as I know, an ordinary day. The one thing that would have made it different was we were getting toward the end of the school year, and our second grade teacher, Miss Salmon, had consigned to me a medicine cactus and one of the aloe plants, and I was to take care of it for the summer and then bring it back in the fall. Cut ahead. That was more important to me after the tornado, to make sure it was okay, because Miss Salmon was a very, very kind but a very exacting woman. So the aloe plant, whether I brought it home that day or within a few days before it was here in the house when the tornado struck, in a small pot.
Okay, so did you go with your dad?
Oh yes.
So you were in Britain Square at that time?
Went to Britain Square, which from here on Upper Burncoat, you go through Lower Burncoat and then Britain Square. So even now it's probably no more than 10 minutes from this house to his parents' house. Mm-hmm. And then whatever we did there, I don't remember anything particular, except that the sky turned as black as could possibly be. And Dad said, we got to go home.
Okay.
Yep.
So your dad recognized that something wasn't right with the weather.
Yeah.
Well, how was it? So you walked home or did you drive?
Oh, no, he drove. He drove in both directions. And when we got as far as what now the Burncoat Senior High is, to our left, there's a valley that leads down to Greendale, and very few houses, if any, were down there. Actually, it was a pond, I remember, because we used to go skating there. And I was in the back seat and very conscious of the fact that the trees were moving up the hill. They were being ripped up by the tornado winds, up by their roots. And I pictured them upright, but I'm sure they were probably coming, and they scraped the top of the car at that point. And we got to probably Rexham Road, and Dad took a right, heading over to Beverly Road, and from there we got down as far as Squantum, and he said, just yelled out, run home and check on your mom. And I suspect that I hadn't gone too far, and he may have even tried to call me back, not knowing what I would discover here at number 16 Calumet. But I remember a few people talking, yelling to them as they yelled to me to find out what I knew. My little second grade mind said, not now, or something like that. Ran to the other end of Calumet, got down here. My mom was outside and with the neighbors. We were very fortunate. We lost our chimney, as they did across the street. There was more damage on the other side of Clark Street, 400 feet north of here, but still it was enough. And all the windows of the house were wide open, because Mom, when she was at Worcester State Teachers College, now Worcester University, Worcester State University, they had told them they had what we would now consider a workshop. What to do if you wind up getting a job in Kansas, for instance, and there are cyclones. So she ran around opening all the windows up. There's some debate nowadays whether you should or shouldn't. And the other was that prior to that, she was in the shower and she thought a train had taken a right-hand turn coming up the hill rather than parallel to us down on West Boston Street. And looked out and saw it was indeed a tornado. So we were very fortunate in the fact that there wasn't a lot of damage to the house. We lost a couple trees in the backyard, and the aloe plant was fine, but my tree house was not. The tree and the tree house met, and the tree house, we had built it, the boys around here. The guy next door, the gentleman next door was a carpenter, so I don't remember him helping us, but we built a tree house anyways, and that was gone as well.
So this entire experience probably took, what, 10, 15 minutes?
Probably. I mean, it's filled with all sorts of anecdotal type of things, but yes, I mean, if there was a timing to it, I'm sure, as with the tornado, because when it hit a certain spot, it was already over with within minutes, also, as you well know. The damage, it had the power to do the kind of damage that was certainly much compressed as far as that was concerned.
I mean, I'm trying to figure out your timeline, not necessarily the tornado's timeline.
I understand, yeah.
So in your experience as a child, what's the time frame? What do you think that whole experience, I mean, because you had to run up the hill.
I was running, and as I'm thinking now, I paused because there was already time for people to come out of some of the worst areas. Down below Calumet, there are duplex houses, and most of them are on slabs. And so many of them were simply totally wiped out. And there were people coming up the hill, wrapped in blankets, some of them dripping blood. And one of the things I very quickly became conscious of was there was one house in the neighborhood just around the corner that somehow they had a telephone that still worked. We did not. And so people were lining up outside of that door already within those few minutes of the tornado going through and my running down to find out here for them. And there were children, some were my classmates, some would have been First Communion kids. We had made our First Communion only a couple weeks before. And so I kind of recognized some, but I didn't delay because I wanted to get back here and find out how my mother was. And Dad came along within another 15 minutes once he could find a place to leave the car. I don't know how I know how he walked here, but how he went back and got his car and was able to transport it and drive it here. So.
Mm-hmm. So your neighborhood, one of the things that I'm hearing from a lot of people is the utter randomness of this.
Yeah.
You know, people would talk about, this was safe, and yet two blocks over, everything was just destroyed.
Yeah. And see, the tornado, it came across. It wasn't going, I'm going to say, a straight east to west. It was like northwest to southeast. And so as it came along, it hit, devastating St. Michael's Church, and it took out the parish hall at Holy Rosary, but it crossed Clark Street further down. So while we got the effect of the wind, we were on the outskirts of it, and by the time we went 3 or 4 streets down on both sides of Clark Street, that's where you get the total wiping out of entire blocks. Uncatina, for instance, and St. Nicholas, and some of those others. And then from there, running across into Great Brook Valley, Curtis Apartments, And then the poor farm, it really wiped out the poor farm as a result of its route before it went across to across Lake Quinsigamond. Now, we didn't leave the neighborhood. We couldn't because driving was impossible. But there were people looking for whatever anybody could give. But utilities were gone. I know that we had bottled gas because the gas lines, which were destroyed, the gas lines stop. I'm at number 16, and the gas lines stop at like number 10. But the result was no electricity and no gas, but we had gas, and Dad very quickly, within a day, painted up a sign saying, "Come in and cook here."
Oh.
And he had a note on it, if we're not home, it would be far enough along, we might be able to get out of here. He left the keys with one of the other neighbors, and we developed lifelong friends as a result of it, because we were one of the few places word got around. Go to the Bartletts, you can cook there and find a place of some comfort anyways.
Hot food at that point was really...
Yep,
Yeah.
but they wanted the people to have the dignity not just of receiving, but creating their own. And that was important as well too. And there was, no question of paying for the use of our gas. It's what neighbors do for neighbors.
So now, did your family, when you got home, I'm sure your mother must have been beside herself.
Oh yeah,
when she saw you.
sure. I bet she almost smothered me for all I remember now. "Oh, Ma, stop that," that sort of thing. And all the neighbors were pretty well shaken. Like I say, even though we didn't know the full extent of it until looking like refugees. And I've seen some of the snapshots of people who literally the clothes was ripped off of them and just dressed in blankets or something like that. And you read about it, and they, people just grabbing a coverlet from their bed and say, "Here, put this on," and so on. But much like we would see pictures of Europe after World War II, it felt like that. And even from my young mind, I was aware of seeing pictures on TV of other disasters and seeing that we were part of it too. So.
So your family, did you stay in the house long, or did you go down to your grandparents' house?
No, we stayed here. And I smiled because within a few hours, coming up this Calumet, they were grandparents. I was 7, Dad's would be probably they were in their 50s or early 60s. Up the road comes a man and woman. She had on a pith helmet that had a CD for civil defense on it, and they both had armbands at civil defense. My grandparents had been, during the Second World War, had been in their neighborhood making sure during blackouts that people had their curtains down. And so they walked up Lincoln Street and then up Beverly Road with a picnic basket and coming to bring food to their son and daughter-in-law and grandson. And so here they are before it was sunset, they're bringing food to us, and they could have driven as far as maybe State Mutual down on Lincoln Street, but not much further than that. And so there was some of that, of people reaching out to each other, and conscious of the fact that some of my playmates' parents, their fathers, for instance, worked at Norton's or worked downtown, and so they were showing up. This street at that time, keep in mind, none of these streets were paved. Beverly Road was paved and Bay State, but Longmeadow, Calumet, all the way down were all dirt, which just added to the stones and dirt being flown around. And so they were coming up from Norton's on foot. But this street was an interesting mix of either Irish Catholics or Swedish Lutheran. I mean, we lived in peace with each other, but that was the reality. And many of the Swedish Lutherans worked at Norton's. In those days, if you were a Swede, you were pretty well guaranteed a job there. And Norton's really got hit, something terrible. And some were able to drive and some had to walk because their cars were wrecked and so on. Others worked in the city. Now, my dad was a teacher, so he was out of school by that time. But others who were office workers were getting out at 5 o'clock and would have gotten as far as the buses could go and then had to walk the rest of the way. So there were family reunions going on all that evening. I know, and I'm sure that there were many that I wasn't aware of that was happening as they awaited somebody coming along.
So now the next day is a Wednesday.
Mm-hmm.
What happens for a child on a Wednesday that would normally be a school day? What happened?
I was disappointed. I wanted to go to school because there were friends I would not see except at school. And I don't mean because of tragedy, just there were mates that I would see in the schoolyard, and we were informed, no, school is over for this year. And I thought it was quite unfair because Miss Salmonen, as intense as she was, I'll put it that way, was very kind to us, and so we wouldn't see her. And one of the things that I was supposed to get that week was the class picture, and we didn't get. I got the class picture finally 40 years afterwards. I was at a gathering for this same Miss Salmonen, celebrating her like 80th birthday, and she had a pile of the school pictures in case any of us showed up. And so I finally could say my set of school pictures is complete. So I know that was it, but beyond that, there was cleanup that was absolutely expected of me. What I could do, clean up in the backyard. That treehouse couldn't just be left there. The apple tree got blown down. That was a shame and all that. But I am positive, without getting more specific, that this was not a sleep-in day. This was like, all right, probably worked until dark. I know that from the night before. It being Wednesday, didn't matter that it was Wednesday. There was major cleanup that had to get started. We were told that the president was aware of it. I remember hearing that. I don't know, there were no radios as such, certainly no battery radios in those days. If somebody had a shortwave, maybe those worked, but I doubt it. Just word got around, and the newspaper printed. I've got the newspaper from the Telegram and the Gazette from that Wednesday, and we have copies of them, so they were available. And it may have been a paper boy, or maybe the going up to the corner and buying a copy. But Dad had all those newspapers for the rest of the month, just to be able to keep track of it. And they've never been thrown away. So I was going through them recently. But it was the mayhem of the day before was met by, one, in the evening, calmness. The only thing breaking it were the sounds of sirens, of ambulances sometimes able to get to, or stretcher bearers having to cross through certain areas. But the next day was as typical a day as it could be. I think the weather was okay. Going back 70 years to a 7-year-old, I have snatches of things. There was nobody who said, now make sure you remember this 70 years from now. We remembered because we started getting word of people who were hurt. Some people that did have to move out because their houses were destroyed. But that was all grown-up talk. And if I could find Richie next door and he was okay, and Tommy down the street, literally people that I hung out with, and your neighborhood at that stage, except when walking to school, walking home, your neighborhood was basically the block you lived on. There were sufficient friends, and I know that we reached out to each other, not out of fear, but out of wonder that this storm came through. Not out of fear because we didn't have the experience of it, except, of course, for the damage that was done, and the damage was slight compared to those people, the refugees coming up Ontario, coming up Clark Street, coming out of Great Brook Valley and finding their way up into this neighborhood, because there was very little for them to find down in their home areas.
When you went to church the next Sunday, what was that experience like? Do you remember anything about that?
Well, I remember some because when we would have gotten to the church, the parish hall was almost destroyed. Not as much as St. Michael's was, but of the two parishes that I would have had contact with, I don't know about whether the Lutheran church down there got hit, whether any others, but the church, I know it lost part of the church roof, but not so you couldn't have mass there. And again, so long as there was some normality, here's my mother, here's my father, here are some of the neighbors that I know, okay, there's a certain pattern that still is there, even though whether we walked or I'm sure they cleared the streets as quickly as possible. And it may be that we were able to drive, but more likely we walked. Getting to church was usually about a half an hour route that we'd go. And among the things I remember, because I saw a picture of it, it brought back to me, at the top of Fales Street, Fales and Beverly and Burncoat, there was an ice cream shop, what is now the Bay State Bank, and that was severely damaged, but more so the other corner, which is now a pizza place, was a drugstore, and it was really severely taken out. I found out afterwards that the druggists stayed there or came back into it, and so when people came and they needed to have their prescriptions filled, they were still doing it. And they just, here they are in the midst of the ruin, and you can find certainly pictures of it, and they were just in the midst of all of this, and yet they had their duty to perform, and so they did so. Within days, I discovered there was a group called the Salvation Army, and they started showing up. They were the way an ice cream truck would on a hot summer day, but they were handing out milk and they were handing out donuts. They were making us feel very comfortable to the point that my friends and I, we looked forward to that. We liked free donuts. And my mother saying to me, I remember very definitely, we do not need those handouts. We accepted them at the very beginning, but by that time, some degree of normality had gotten in. And she said, we do not need them. There are people who need them more than we do. You're not to take them anymore. Oh, Ma. And,
so it's, going into summer. Summer, of course, is woohoo for kids.
yeah.
Do you remember anything from because the photos I've seen is the cleanup happened very quickly. I was very impressed how quickly the cleanup was done. Looked at a lot of photographs of this. But what was summer like for the kids around here? Do you have any memories from that summer?
I will remember afterwards, because a number of those classmates of mine who were from down in the valley, down below, when I didn't see them all summer, they opened within days in Spencer, I think it was the YMCA camp. And I mean, it was interesting because it was applied ecumenism right then. So the religious leaders like our bishop, the Episcopal bishop, the Lutheran leaders and so on, and they dragooned all the people that they could to go out to Camp Marshall, I think it was, and prepare it as a refugee shelter. And the kids as well as their parents. And I know that they did the same thing there, and I suspect that that was common, that any of the different camps to which kids would be going during the summer became family refuge places. And so it would not be till afterwards, because again, they were people from a few streets down, and except knowing them at school, I wouldn't see them, but conscious of the fact that they had survived. And when I'd ask, well, what about this and what about that? And fully 3/4 or more of my friends, definitely that was, or classmates, definitely that was the story, they were okay, but they had been brought to out of town so they could do the cleanup. You're talking about, and of course down below, you still see a few vacant lots and where houses were. Never traveled down there even in good weather. Had no reason to. That was the project, and they were houses that were primarily at one stage for returning veterans. So we had very little to do down there, but no, I think as kids we bounced back, and our parents would have wanted us to bounce back as soon as possible, and just to get on with whatever cleanup needed to be done. Not as much here as I've said, but certainly in other parts. And when we go to church on Sunday, never missing, but when we go to church on Sunday, you'd get caught up on something, and this person had survived, this person had not. And of course, Assumption College, which is now Quincy, was very visibly, really affected, destroyed.
Many of the nuns were killed.
Two of the nuns, one of the priests. Unlike, fortunately, like Holy Cross, they had their commencement that day, and during that early afternoon, Holy Cross had their commencement, and but more importantly, St. John's, I found out afterwards, St. John's Church in downtown Worcester had confirmation, and it was understood that all of the priests in the area would come to the confirmation, each to support the kids, to cheer them on, and so on. As a result of it, when the tornado struck, you had all these priests already together, and so they could be said, you go to St. Vincent's, you go to Hanneman Hospital, you go to City Hospital. There was Doctors Hospital in those days as well too, and they were dragooned, again to use the term, by the bishop to go and look after these. And then, I suspect that the priests from this neighborhood, Holy Rosary, St. Joan of Arc, which is down on Lincoln Street, wherever the priests from St. Michael's were, I have no question on the fact that they would have found themselves back looking at their property, but more importantly, looking for their parishioners.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, St. Michael's had mass this following Sunday.
Right.
And they did what they could, and they had the mass, I believe, actually, I'm not confirmed, I believe it was outside.
Sure, yeah.
An outside mass. So do you think there was any impact in your life? I mean, is there anything that you think?
I remember being skittish for a long time when there was a thunderstorm, and going to see, within the next years after that was The Wizard of Oz was making its rounds again. I think in the movie theaters, but definitely on TV. And I would either close my eyes or leave the room when the tornado strikes. Um, I've overcome it, but it was just one of these. Excuse me. It was one of these things that, yeah, I mean, I only saw the effects of it. I was not aware of ever seeing the tornado. In
Oh,
1955, we traveled out to Oklahoma, where my father's only brother lives. And as we got to Tulsa, and it might have been 54, but as we got to Tulsa on the radio were tornado warnings. And my sister had been born, and so there were the four of us in the car, very much aware of the fact that there were tornado warnings. We didn't know the extent of Tulsa, except it was a Tulsa radio station telling people, to take shelter if you lived in this area. Well, we just kept on driving because what else do you do? So there was some of that, but I won't say that it affected me the rest of my life. But there were also certain days where my mates and I would say, "It smells like a tornado day." There was something that was in the air evidently prior to it. And I mentioned at the very beginning about the wind blowing through the wires, whether it's at all connected with that, but there was a certain scent that we remembered. And even now, I can still say on occasion, it smells like a tornado.